Yeah. Good evening, everybody. And my name is Nandan Nilekani. I'm one of the trustees of the New India Foundation. And I'd like to welcome all of you to this event, which is the 12th annual NIF lecture. As you know, New India Foundation is a trust set up. It was set up in 2006 by Ram and myself over lunch at Koshi's, that famous watering hole. And in those days, Ram still ate fish. So he ate fish, and I had crabs served by Prem Koshi. And he was, at that time, working on his India After Gandhi. He had just come out with that book. And he was commenting on the fact that everything in India about history is ancient history, and we don't really have enough books and so on about modern history after 1947. And that led to the starting of the New India Foundation. And it's been a remarkably prolific organization. It's given 40 fellowships over the last 12 years to very, very diverse set of people, and they have been extremely productive. Out of those 40 fellowships, 22 have actually published books, which is a very high record in this kind of activity, and 10 of them are on their way. So that's a very high track record. And Ram has really led on this from the front. He's not only led in the shortlisting and selection of the possible people for the book, is also actually helped the writers in shaping the book, in critiquing what they've written, and I suspect in some cases rewriting the book. So that is his contribution to that. And so it's been very prolific, and recently we've said that it's time to move on and pass on the leadership. I'm very happy that Manish Sabharwal, the entrepreneur and intellectual and policy maker, and Srinath Raghavan, army officer and historian, have joined as the trustees of the New India Foundation, and they will carry on the mantle of whatever we're trying to do here. And just that you guys think that it's just some 4 men doing this stuff, happy to inform you that our jury actually is much more diverse. We have Rukmini Banerjee and Nirja Jayal as jury members in selecting the books that we have every year. You also know that we this year launched our book award, and the first book award was announced at the Bangalore Lit Fest and went to Milan Vaishnav on his book on politics and money, and that also will be an annual event. The lecture itself has been around now for 12 years, and we've had very eminent speakers, Ila Bhatt, Sunil Kilnani, Raghuram Rajan, Arvind Subramaniam. So it's really been a very good set of lectures. And when we began this idea of a lecture series, we actually were rotating it, in the sense we would do one in Delhi and one in Calcutta and so on. But then we said, this better be in Bangalore. So for the last 6-7 years, I think we have been having it in Bangalore, and it's become an important part of Bangalore's, hopefully, intellectual calendar. So with this, I'd like to hand over to, I think, Srinath, who's going to introduce the speaker and take it forward. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's a real privilege for me to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Sunil Amrith, who is the Mehra Family Professor of South Asian Studies and Professor of History at Harvard University, where he's also the chair of the Department of South Asian Studies. By way of introduction, may I say a few words about why Sunil Amrith's scholarship is not only distinguished, but also distinctive. I think it's fair to say that, in the last 30 years or so, the study of modern Indian history has been marked by its depth and diversity, but there has also been a certain insularity of perspective. And Sunil Amrith has been at the crest of a wave of scholarship, which is trying to place modern Indian history within the larger framework of transnational, Asian, and indeed global history. Sunil took his PhD from the University of Cambridge and was also a junior fellow at Trinity College, where he wrote his first book, Decolonizing International Health, which is a pioneering study of the early history of the World Health Organization. And the book already had the signatures of what would mark Sunil's scholarship going forward, grappling with ideas and institutions simultaneously, but also a comparative perspective between South and Southeast Asia, which is quite distinctive. Sunil then went on to write his second book called Migration and Diaspora in Modern Asia, which is an ambitious synthesis and a remarkable work of insight, and I must say concision as well. In just under 250 pages, he covers the history of migration in this huge continent over the last 150 years. His third and highly acclaimed book was Crossing the Bay of Bengal, The Furies of Nature and the Fortunes of Migrants, which to me is a remarkable, elegant, and humane history of the movement of people, ideas, goods, and institutions within a very distinctive ecological space. Now, this extraordinary work brings together human and natural histories into one frame of inquiry, which I think is a signal and very distinctive contribution. This book also, in many ways, presaged his more recent interest in the environmental history of India, South Asia, and indeed Southeast Asia. And he has a forthcoming book coming out practically in a couple of weeks from now, which is called Unruly Waters: How Mountains, Rivers, Monsoons Have Shaped South Asia's History. So I'd highly recommend all of you to keep a lookout. On a personal note, I must add that amongst historians of my generation, and there are at least a couple of us sitting here, I think it's fair to say that the historian we all look forward to reading the most is Sunil. His work has been recognized through many awards. He's been a recipient of the Infosys Prize for Humanities in 2016, and more recently he received the very prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, which is also colloquially known as the Genius Grant. Today, Sunil will be talking to us about water and the making of modern India. So without further ado, Professor Sunil Amrith.
I shall struggle to live up to such a generous introduction from one of the historians that I admire most. So thank you, Srinath. It's an honor to be here. I would like to thank the trustees of the New India Foundation for inviting me. Their work in their respective fields has been an inspiration to me, and I think never has it been more vital for there to be an enlightened, non-partisan source of support for new research on India's modern and contemporary history at a time when young people, not only in India but in every country I know, are increasingly disconnected from the past. The Foundation is doing vital work in encouraging and supporting scholarship. Since I am in Bangalore, I'd also like to thank the Infosys Science Foundation based here. Their support has made possible some of the work that I'm going to share with you this evening. My subject tonight is water and the making of modern India. So let me begin with a well-worn cliché. In 1909, the finance minister in the British Imperial Government of India declared that every budget is a gamble on the rains. That phrase has been repeated countless times since then. It appears still in newspaper articles almost every year. Half a century after that, the sentiment held. For us in India, scarcity is only a missed monsoon away, Indira Gandhi said in the late 1960s. And then just last year, in a lecture that she presented at Harvard, one of India's best-known environmentalists, Sunita Narayan, declared in an off-the-cuff remark, India's finance minister is the monsoon. At one level, this is simply to state a basic truth. Even today, close to 60% of India's agriculture remains rain-fed, subject to a monsoon climate that has always been subject to intense seasonality and a good deal of internal variability. But the story I want to tell this evening is not one of climate as destiny. Rather, it is a story of how the idea of climate as destiny has had significant political implications in modern India. When I mentioned recently to somebody that I was working on a history of the monsoon, they asked skeptically, does the monsoon need a history? What sort of history? The monsoon has a natural history. We see that in Pranay Lal's recent wonderful book, Indica, A Deep Natural History of the Subcontinent. The monsoon has evolved over tens of millions of years, and it has left an archive of that natural history on the seabed and on the land. Tiny algae, diatoms, and single-celled marine plants called Radiolara show that the monsoons first appeared in the Miocene era, soon after the Himalayas erupted from the collision of the island Indian peninsula and the Eurasian landmass. Traces embedded in tree rings tell us that the Asian summer monsoon has strengthened during warm interglacial periods, such as the so-called medieval warm period up to the 14th century, and has weakened during periods of planetary cooling. Since the late 19th century, meteorologists in India have pioneered the study of the periodicity of the monsoon's internal variation, leading to the discovery of how the monsoon is teleconnected, as they say, with other parts of the global climate, including through the El Niño Southern Oscillation. But the monsoon also has a human history, which is what I am concerned with this evening. The monsoon has shaped and continues to shape patterns of economic life in India. One of the most fundamental shifts over the past half-century is the coming together of the monsoon's natural and human history, reflected in the mounting evidence that human activity is affecting the monsoon. It has a history in the sense of the history of science, a history of climate science in India, which is a story that remains to be told. The monsoon also has a human history in the sense of a history of ideas about climate, nature, and society. And I'll suggest this evening that water has been central to different conceptions of India's freedom and India's future. The monsoon has long evoked many emotions: anxiety, longing, joy, wistfulness. I will focus mostly on the prosaic in my lecture, but we also need histories of rapture, histories of the monsoon in Indian music, art, and literature. I could begin this story in ancient times with the stepwells of Gujarat, with the tanks of this region. But let me focus this evening on the modern period, not least because the New India Foundation's, I think, important emphasis on modern and contemporary history. Since we are in Bangalore, let me open with two different approaches to the problem of water in early 20th century India, both of them born of this region. One of the enduring heroes of India's attempt to transform its waters was, of course, M. Visvesvaraya. He was born to a poor family in Mysore in 1860. He studied engineering in Pune's College of Science, served the government of Bombay for 25 years as an engineer in the Department of Public Works. He was ascetic in his beliefs, a firm believer in hard work and self-help. When he was redesigning the water supply of Pune, he patented a new system of automatic sluice gates, which remained in use for decades afterwards. But in keeping with his dedication to public service, he gave up any claim to royalties. From the outset, he was obsessed with what he called the waste of water. He grappled with, quote, how to bring under control the irregular distribution of water in India, and what he thought of as its wasteful use. He found to his frustration that the cultivators were unaccustomed to control by engineers. To assert that control over water would be his lifelong mission. Visvesvaraya is well established in the pantheon of national heroes. Almost forgotten, however, is his colleague in the Mysore government, J.S. Chakravarti. Chakravarti too flourished in Mysore state, which was bolder than any part of British India in its approach to the problems of water, at least in the early 20th century. Chakravarti worked for Mysore State Insurance Committee for many years, and in the 1910s he rose to the position of controller and financial secretary to the government of Mysore. He too was concerned with climatic vulnerability, but his solution was a very powerful idea: weather insurance for India's farmers. Chakravarti advocated a system of drought insurance in preference over generalized crop insurance. He thought that while the failure of a particular crop could be put down to bad practice or neglect on the part of individual cultivators, a failure in the rains affected everybody. His proposal was that when rainfall dipped below a certain proportion, say 30% of the annual average, that cultivators would receive a payout. Chakravarti saw rainfall insurance as, in his words, intimately connected with three sciences: economics, meteorology, and agriculture. His starting point was that Indian agriculture is dependent almost entirely on rainfall, and that therefore the quantity of rain during the year and its distribution are the only essential factors in determining the incomes of farmers. Only the state, he believed, could carry out an insurance scheme on the scale he envisaged, though he hoped that private providers might eventually enter the market. The case for insurance was clear in his mind. Agricultural insurance will also be famine insurance, Chakravarti declared. For under present circumstances, a famine in India does not generally mean grain famine, but money famine due to the enforced unemployment of the agriculturist. But Chakravarti's scheme gathered dust. One commentator observed towards the end of the 20th century that Chakravarti's scheme was far in advance of what the World Bank had come up with by the early 1990s. The primary reason for this neglect is that the approach to mitigating climatic risk epitomized by Vishveshvaraya prevailed, an approach that emphasized engineering over precautionary solutions to the problem of water, though there was no necessary contradiction between the two. Let us consider how both of their initiatives, though, built upon a complex inheritance of ways of thinking about and controlling water. Chakravarti's scheme depended, for a start, on the massive accumulation of rainfall data in India that had been a product of the development of Indian meteorological department from the 1870s onwards. The pioneering work of meteorologists like Henry Blanford, Ruchi Ram Sahni, and Gilbert Walker. It was only because of the existence of that data that Chakravarti felt confident to base his whole scheme on the shortfall from an average amount of seasonal rainfall district by district. Now, a whole chapter of his book, in fact, describes the meteorological apparatus of India that had developed into thousands of monitoring stations by the 1910s. For his part, Vishveshvaraya worked within an involving hybrid tradition of hydraulic engineering in India, which he was shaped by and in turn departed from. The work of Arthur Cotton, restoring the Grand Anicut on the Kaveri, the Dhauleshwaram barrage on the Godavari, and his subsequent scaling up of those ambitions set a precedent for what was possible. But Cotton and his ilk were not working on a blank slate. The tradition of hydraulic engineering along India's southern rivers was a layered one. British engineers in the south showed respect, if sometimes grudging respect, for the genius of those who had preceded them, though they always fell back on the self-interested argument that only British skill could rescue that infrastructure from decay and neglect. Note, too, that by the first decade of the 20th century, Vishveshvaraya's view of water was truly global, encompassing Japan, which he admired more than any other country, Europe, the United States, and the Middle East, where he had worked on Aden's water supply, deputed by the government of Bombay. In all of this, South India was particularly open to experiment and innovation, and this was down to many factors. There was the presence of relatively progressive princely governments in Mysore and Travancore. Then there was the fact that, as David Washbrook has shown, even some British officials in Madras had a sense of, even identified with, the distinctiveness of South India. Materially, South India had an especially complex inheritance of water infrastructure, from dispersed networks of tanks to larger dams. Reflecting on the state of India's development, the members of the Indian Industrial Commission wrote confidently in 1918 that the terrible calamities which from time to time depopulated wide stretches of country need no longer be feared. In a monsoon climate, they wrote, failure of the rains must always mean privation and hardship, but it need no longer lead to starvation and loss of life. This conveyed a strong sense that something fundamental had changed in India over the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The risk posed by climate had been mitigated by both policy and by technology, above all, irrigation. As long as India remained predominantly agrarian, some level of risk would remain, they wrote, but the commissioners envisaged a future in which industrialization would provide new employment and greater security as India's population moved from the countryside to the cities. And of course, they predicted a much faster rate of urbanization than, in fact, one saw in India until the end of the 20th century. In the 1870s, the idea that famine was inevitable in India prevailed amongst British administrators. In fact, it justified their inaction to themselves. By the 1920s, most observers believed that India had conquered famine. But the worry about water did not go away. We can see this deep anxiety about the material conditions of life in the ways that many leaders of the nationalist movement thought about freedom. For all of them, water was crucial. Modern science claims to have curbed to a large extent the tyranny and the vagaries of nature, Nehru wrote in 1929. But he realized that there remained a large gap between that potential and the reality of life for millions of Indians. Nehru was clear about the material urgency behind every vision of freedom. Our desire for freedom is a thing more of the mind than the body, he said, but most Indians suffered hunger and deepest poverty, an empty stomach and a bare back. For the masses, Nehru declared, freedom is a vital bodily necessity. Mahatma Gandhi made a different sort of link between nature and freedom. We can see this during the salt satyagraha, which Ram has written about so movingly in his new book. Choosing the British salt tax as the symbolic focus of his satyagraha, Gandhi observed that next to air and water, salt is perhaps the greatest necessity of life. The vital properties of salt linked the coastal ecosystem with the lives of millions inland. But Gandhi's was also an argument about climate and society, climate and inequality. The poorest who labored outdoors, he often pointed out, were most in need of salt. So a wide range of Indian thinkers, scientists, activists drew different lessons from their awareness of pressing material need and the centrality of water to that need. We can see this, for example, in the divergence of opinion in the 1930s between the sociologist Radhakamal Mukherjee on the one hand and the great scientist Meghnad Saha on the other. Both of them were concerned with Bengal's rivers. Both recognized the centrality of water to the livelihood of the people and its importance to India's future. Both saw the pronounced seasonality of the monsoon climate as integral to the nature of the problem. But they saw the future very differently. Mukherjee believed that a restoration of what he called, ahead of his time, ecological balance and respect for the distinctive nature of each riverine ecosystem would provide the seeds for revival. Saha's prescription could not have been more different. Saha was scathing in response to Mukherjee's claim that afforestation and local efforts at soil conservation would strip the Damodar River, for example, of its destructive power. He called the claim that deforestation affected rainfall absurd, a claim for which he wrote there is not a single iota of positive proof. If changes in forest cover and land use had any effect at all on local climate, Saha argued, they must be extremely small compared to the huge monsoon currents, which are primarily responsible for the precipitation of that region. Currents that linked ocean and atmosphere over a vast region. Rainfall was beyond human intervention, but human intervention to transform the landscape could neutralize the threat posed by uncertain rainfall, securing rivers from the alternating paucity and excess of water. And here Saha was confident about the future. We are fortunate to live at a time when the large-scale experience of thousands of dams constructed in the USA since 1915 are at our disposal, he wrote. He believed that the global circulation of ideas and technology, a process of learning, would come to India's aid. In valorizing the American and to some extent Soviet models, Saha was in fact being critical of the British administration, extolling an example that seemed to extend far beyond anything that the sluggish British colonial state could envisage, let alone carry out. Saha imagined the construction of dams in eastern India that would last for hundreds of years. Let me pause here before I proceed to talk about how these multiple strands of thought and intervention influenced India's water policy after independence. My invocation of Saha has brought us to the topic that more than any other has dominated discussions of India's water policy since independence: large dams. As I will discuss in a moment, large dams have undoubtedly been of pivotal importance, symbolically, socially, ecologically, politically. But I think it is a mistake to search the early 20th century only for the roots of India's enthusiasm for large dams. Instead, what I think we see is a multiplicity of ways of addressing India's dependence on the monsoon. These were at once more local and more global than the exclusive focus on large dams as a matter of national policy would suggest. I think one of our tasks as historians is to draw attention to the wide range of possible futures that a diverse group of Indian thinkers imagined at the dawn of independence, and I include water engineers among that group. One of the truly distinctive things about independent India in global perspective is, of course, the establishment of representative democracy, never inevitable and to many people surprising in the face of such pressing material need. In 1951, India carried out its first census after independence. It was at that time the largest census ever undertaken in the world. The average life expectancy in India stood at just 31 years for men and 30 years for women. In the US at the same time, that figure was 65 years for men and 71 for women. For every 1,000 live births in India at the time, more than 140 infants died. This was an indictment of 2 centuries of British rule, since the abstract number, which is the average human lifespan, as French philosopher Georges Canguilhem noted, revealed much about the value attached to life in a given society. The political theorist Uday Mehta has argued that the immediate ambit of political power in post-colonial India was dictated by the intensity of mere life. That is to say, poverty and destitution put most Indians, Mehta writes, interestingly, echoing Nehru's statement that I quoted earlier, under the pressing dictates of their bodies. And the imperative to address these basic needs, he observed, could have no limiting bounds. The 1950s were characterized by boundless ambition and confidence that these dictates of nature might be conquered, combined with a sense of enduring threat. And it's that second that I think we sometimes forget. There is no question that large dams came to symbolize progress and freedom in post-independence India. It was the era when, in Sunil Kilnani's memorable phrase, India fell in love with concrete. There's an excellent visual illustration of the allure of large dams in an exhibition on dams in the nation that was mounted at the Nehru Museum and Library a few years ago when Mahesh Rangarajan was the director. Nehru famously called dams the temples of new India. Dreams of hydraulic engineering were inseparable from dreams of freedom. Kanwar Sen, the second head of India's water authority, wrote that the River Valley projects constitute the biggest single effort since independence to meet the material wants of the people. For from irrigation springs ultimately the sinews of man, from power the sinews of industry. He voiced the hopes of many of India's planners and architects when he declared that dams are indeed the symbol of the aspirations of new India, and the blessings that stream forth from them are the enduring gifts of this generation to posterity. Note here the fusion of the language of science and faith, reason and rapture. One aspect of the story has been well studied, and that is the influence of American hydraulic experts like David Lilienthal, especially on the Damodar Valley Corporation. Dan Klingensmith wrote an excellent book on this, and my friend David Engerman's exhaustive recent history of India and the economic Cold War adds substantial detail. But the point I would like to make here is that the Americans and Soviets were not the only influences on India's love affair with dams, and India in turn shaped approaches to the challenge of water in Southeast Asia. In May 1954, Kanwar Sen chairman of India's Central Water Commission, and K.L. Rao embarked on an official mission to China to inspect and report back on China's water projects, flood control in particular. They were among the first outsiders to see firsthand China's hydrological experiment. Sen and Rao arrived in China on the 5th of May, 1954, and they stayed 2 months. They spent much of their time on the water, making many parts of their journey by boat along the Yangtze River, and they were the chief protagonists of India's own colossal efforts to control water, and yet the scale of work in China dazzled them. They undertook their tour of China half a century after the Indian Irrigation Commission had traveled through India in search of water in 1901, 1902. In some way, they were products of that colonial tradition of hydraulic engineering. Sen had worked in the Punjab Irrigation Department, which of course was particularly notable for its irrigation achievements in the early 20th century. But now they represented an independent nation, and for inspiration they looked not only to Europe, but to revolutionary China. Consider the contrast between the two tours, where the Indian Irrigation Commission traveled in immense luxury on a specially chartered train with a retinue of servants. Sen and Rao were given strictly limited foreign exchange. They were accompanied by just 2 interpreters and 2 officials for the 2-month journey. Their report contains an extended list of every Chinese official they met, from ministers to field engineers to water scientists at the College of Hydraulic Engineering in Nanjing. They were struck by the quality of China's engineers. They delighted in the emphasis given to technical education in China. They praised the Chinese capacity for improvisation, building huge dams from local materials where imports were in short supply. Traveling through China, their thoughts turned naturally to comparisons with India. One of the things that struck them was the clear climatic contrast. Here again, what made India distinctive in their minds was the monsoon. Unlike India, hemmed in by the Himalayas, they wrote, China is open to Central Asia. And that meant that in the summer, the Chinese heartland, unlike India, is not the single objective of the air circulation of a whole ocean. By contrast, China's rivers were more menacing than India's, more prone to burst their banks. So their clear scheme was that India's great need was irrigation, China's was flood control. But both countries eyed an industrial future, and the promise of hydroelectric power attracted them both. India's most eminent water engineers returned from China with the sense that the two countries shared fundamental problems, and that there were lessons they could learn from China, especially for controlling flooding along some of the tributaries of the Ganga. But there were ominous portents, too. In his final speech bidding Sen and Rao farewell, the Chinese Director of Water Resources had described how China's water projects had, quote, been extended to the border regions of our fraternal minorities and helped to promote national unity. There was never an attempt on the Chinese side to disguise the fact that water was intrinsic to political power. The conquest of water meant the conquest of space. Unspoken was the thought that someday the border regions in question may include China's borders with India. Sen and Rao faced another problem when they returned, carrying in their hands the first ever maps of China's water projects to be seen outside China. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs was immediately picked up what Sen and Rao had missed, which is that the Chinese maps claimed as Chinese territory vast parts of the border region that the Indian state saw as integral to India. The maps were destroyed, redrawn to accord with India's understanding of its territorial boundaries. Sen later wrote in his memoirs that he was grateful that had been caught before the volume was published. If it had not, he said, it would have been a source of great embarrassment a few years later when China and India went to war over just those borders. Tellingly, Sen and Rao's amazing report was, after 1962, treated as a classified document for many years. As China's experiences inspired India's engineers, so India's became a model for the rest of the region. In 1955, the director of the UN's Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, ECAFE, the South Indian economist P. Loganathan, commissioned Sen to join a UN mission to survey the Mekong River. The prick has gone too deep to be halted. This is how Sen described his sense that large-scale hydraulic engineering was inevitable now in the Mekong as elsewhere in Asia, given the bold claims that had been made on their behalf, given the hunger for progress and development that he saw wherever he went. The Mekong Commission, which he led, was quickly overshadowed by the escalation of American involvement in Indochina as the US became mired in military conflict in Vietnam that engulfed Vietnam's neighbors as well. And from then on, there was a very close bond between American support for dam construction and American strategic imperatives, indeed military imperatives, in local wars. But Sen stayed on, and this is striking. He was a patriotic Indian engineer at the pinnacle of his profession, enamored of China, yet with close professional links to the US Bureau of Reclamation. He chose to spend a decade of his career in the Mekong Commission, trying to coordinate the development of Asia's most transboundary river, notwithstanding the power politics which stymied the scheme. In his memoir, Sen hints that the material reward of working for the UN was one clear incentive, but his motivations went deeper. He believed, like so many of his generation, that taming the waters was a goal beyond ideology. Working for ECAFE alongside many former colonial civil servants and engineers, he held to a vision of Asian nations working together to claim their rightful place in the community of nations. In a memoir that is detached, even clinical in tone, a rare moment of emotion comes when Sen describes what he calls his pilgrimage to the site of Angkor Wat in Cambodia while on his first Mekong mission. I was very much moved by the ancient glory and culture of India reflected in Angkor, he wrote. Just as many of India's water engineers presented their own new temples as standing within a deep historical tradition of water engineering, so Sen appealed to a deep history of cultural exchange across borders to provide ballast for his vision of Asia united by shared responses to the challenge of water. By the mid-1960s, the approach to water that epitomized the post-independence period ran into trouble. In 1965 and 66, large parts of India suffered from drought. This threatened food shortages, even led to famine being declared in Bihar for the first time since independence. India's growing and uncomfortable dependence on American food aid was clearly illustrated by the monsoon failures. How helplessly we are at the mercy of the elements, a Times of India editorial lamented in 1965, arguing that all India had to show for the previous decade of development efforts was, dismissively, some shallow and tentative improvements in irrigation. The man charged with remedying the situation was C. Subramaniam, a protege of Rajaji. The crux of Subramaniam's strategy was to concentrate modern inputs in irrigated areas. This is a prosaic way to describe a fundamental shift. From the 19th century onwards, India's geography of water had shaped plans for the country's future. Now the difference between irrigated and rain-fed lands would be accepted as a necessary inequality, even as a matter of strategy. It drove what we now know as the Green Revolution, which combined substantive irrigation inputs with new high-yielding seed varieties that had first been tried in Mexico and the Philippines. The precondition for the growth of the Green Revolution in India was a massive expansion in irrigation. And the water available from the dams, from the surface irrigation works, however monumental in scale, was clearly insufficient. Cultivators in drier parts of India have known for centuries, and British administrators recognized in the 19th century that India's groundwater resources provided the most reliable insurance against drought. As early as the 1880s, British authorities in both Bombay and Madras had experimented with the use of electric pumps to extract groundwater. The government of the United Provinces in the 1930s encouraged a large-scale scheme to use electric motors to power groundwater pumps. In 1950, there were around 150,000 electric pumps in use across India. By 2000, that number was 19 million, and India had become the largest user of groundwater in the world, greater than China. Until the 1960s, groundwater could not be mobilized on a large enough scale to meet India's food requirements. The widespread use of electric pumps transformed that equation. As the lawyer Philippe Coulet has shown, India's groundwater law continues to be shaped by colonial precedents that accorded absolute rights over groundwater to property owners without recognizing the importance of groundwater as a public resource. So large dams held out the promise of irrigation water and hydroelectric power. In the groundwater era, demands for water and energy came together in a slightly different way. State governments encouraged the pursuit of productivity by subsidizing the capital costs of the infrastructure for the intensive exploitation of groundwater. State electricity boards reduced the cost of electricity to farmers. By the 1970s, unable to bear the cost of monitoring energy use, they went for flat tariffs. As a result, agriculture's share of total energy use in India grew from 10% in 1970 to more than 30% by 1995, even as state electricity boards accumulated huge losses. And groundwater now accounts for 60% of India's irrigated area, surface irrigation for only 30%. All the while, and despite the declining importance of surface irrigation, the profusion of large dams has continued. In fact, the 1970s were the peak decade for dam construction, large dam construction in India. And their social and ecological costs have multiplied. Since the 1950s, dam construction has displaced millions of people in India, compounding the loss of land and livelihood with the ruptures to community bonds through the incomplete process of resettlement. The range of estimates for the numbers of people displaced by dam projects in India ranges very widely, from 16 million on the low end to 40 million on the upper end. And the number of sources that have tried to do this, the World Commission on Dams in 2000, the Red Cross in 2012, the work of the activist Warren Fernandez, the geographer Sanjoy Chakravarti, they come to very widely disparate estimates, but nevertheless, even on the lower end, that is a very large number of people. And by almost all of these accounts, Adivasis have been the worst affected, least able to negotiate adequate compensation from state and local governments. The ecological consequences of large dams have also been concentrated in their catchment areas. Reservoirs have drowned millions of hectares of forest. Canals and barrages have disrupted water flow and drainage, sometimes accompanied by a rise in vector-borne diseases. There was nothing inevitable about this outcome. We should not miss the ambivalence with which the costs of development were viewed, both within the state and in civil society. Even as large projects were pushed forward, sometimes heedless to loss and protest, this was accompanied by a growing consciousness across India of sustainability and loss. Indira Gandhi was one of, I think, only 2 heads of state to attend the UN's first conference on the human environment, held in Stockholm in June 1972. In her rousing speech to the plenary session, which Jairam Ramesh's recent book nicely sets in context, she discussed the ecological problems that were already a matter of public discussion in India. Mrs. Gandhi set out a position that saw environmental degradation as primarily a problem of poverty, a problem of distribution, not of numbers. She reminded her audience that we inhabit a divided world. She attributed historical responsibility for the despoilation of Earth where she felt it belonged, with the wealthy countries of the world. Many of the advanced countries of today have reached their present affluence by their domination over other races and countries, she said, and through the exploitation of natural resources. We do not wish to impoverish the environment any further, she insisted, and yet we cannot for a moment forget the grim poverty of large numbers of people. Her most resonant phrase, the phrase for which that speech is remembered, was in the form of a question. Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters? Mrs. Gandhi concluded by describing to the audience how she saw India's quest since 1947. For the last quarter of a century, she said, we have been engaged in an enterprise unparalleled in human history. That is the provision of basic needs to 1/6 of mankind within the span of 1 or 2 generations. It is such a startlingly simple insight, but one that we have perhaps forgotten. In this evocation of speed, urgency, and scale, lay Mrs. Gandhi's recognition of the demographic and material transformation that was sweeping the world, the process that environmental historians now refer to as the Great Acceleration. In the 1970s, many disparate concerns came together to constitute an overarching problem of the environment. Population growth, the finitude of natural resources, concerns about the impact of rapid development on human health, concerns about species extinction and disappearing habitats. The international conference coincided with the earliest attempts to confront these challenges at home in India. Mrs. Gandhi sponsored the Water Act of 1974, which was among the first attempts to deal with an environmental issue on a national basis. Action from the top down was often pushed by a growing environmental consciousness from civil society. These included rural movements like the famous Chipko movement, as well as urban activism. For instance, the So Clean group in Mumbai in the 60s and 70s, which took an early interest in both air and water pollution. Since the 1970s, the wave of opposition to large dams has grown into one of India's largest social and political mobilizations. At the same time, many environmental activists have turned to history. They've turned to indigenous practices of water harvesting and conservation. Drawing on a tradition of thought that goes back to Radha Kamal Mukherjee, to Gandhi, they sought the principles of ecological balance in traditional practices of farming, fishing, and artisanal production. If there's one thing I've come to repeatedly in my talk, it is that India has been shaped by multiple, intersecting, sometimes contending ways of thinking about and acting upon water. And it is with that point that I would like to conclude. While hydraulic engineering has attracted by far the greatest amount of both funding and public attention, while unrestrained groundwater exploitation has fueled agricultural expansion at the cost of sustainability, everyday ways to mitigate climate risk have continued to be important to India. The development of Indian meteorology, for example, took place unheralded, and the second half of the 20th century saw significant improvements in both short and long-term forecasting, as well as the generation of vast quantities of rainfall data that would later be used by climatologists to build their models. Institutions like the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology in Pune have been at the forefront of international research. The infrastructure of disaster management at state and district levels has grown more comprehensive. While the numbers of people affected by natural disasters has grown exponentially because of population growth and urban expansion, the death toll has declined dramatically. Finally, the Indian state's response to weather-related scarcity has grown in reach and efficiency. Relief policy, developed from an extension of the famine codes of the late 19th century, has been crucial in preventing monsoon failures from causing large-scale starvation deaths in India since independence. And while they've been starved of resources and support, local efforts at water conservation and water harvesting too continue to play a vital role in a diverse ecosystem. So just a few words to conclude. I'm neither a water policy expert nor an engineer. I'm concerned with what the perspective of history, environmental history, political and intellectual history, economic history, can bring to illuminating some of these current challenges. Living with the uncertainty of the monsoon has been an inherent part of life in India from the earliest times. Over centuries, South Asian societies have evolved complex social and economic institutions, including astonishingly sophisticated irrigation systems, to mitigate the fundamental problem of uneven rainfall and variable river flow. Between the late 19th and the late 20th century, the management of India's water resources changed scale, underpinned by confidence in technology's capacity to channel, even conquer nature, what the late Ramaswamy Iyer described as a Promethean attitude to nature. The intellectual and infrastructural legacies of that era, epitomized but not exclusively represented by an investment in massive hydraulic engineering, still shape water policy in South Asia, not just in India. But as the legal scholar Jedediah Purdy has argued in a beautiful book he wrote called After Nature, the material world that we inhabit is in many ways a memorial to a long-running legacy of contested ideas about nature. The current landscape of water in modern India is an outcome of just such a legacy of contested ideas. Colonial responses to an unfamiliar and unpredictable climate as they sought to expand agrarian capitalism. Nationalist ideas about securing India from famine and deprivation. The ideas of scientists and engineers who imagined new ways to harness water. And not least, the ideas of hundreds of millions of Indian voters who demanded for their communities and their regions the fruits of progress and development. It is also an outcome of vast inequalities. Inequalities in access to land, to water, and to energy. Inequalities in different groups' ability to participate in the decisions that govern their lives and livelihoods. So we contend today with the consequences of both the successes and failures of what Indira Gandhi called the unparalleled effort to provide for the basic needs of 1/6 of humanity. The scale of the water crises facing India today is sobering. But the most important lesson that a historical perspective holds is that water management never has been and never can be a purely technical or even purely scientific question. Ideas about the distribution and management of water in India are deeply inflected with cultural values, with notions of justice, with hopes and fears of nature, and with the enduring quest for freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunil, for that absolutely magisterial and instructive lecture. So I'll begin by asking a few questions, partly because I was so stimulated by what he said, and partly because I began life as an environmental historian, though it's been many years since I worked on the field. But your lecture stimulated me to think about some of the things I learned and studied a long time ago. Now, listening to you speak, and I really look forward to the book, which will be out in a month. Yeah. Okay. Now, I recall an essay written by an environmental scientist called Jayanta Bandyopadhyay in EPW 1987, where he said, "Water, not oil, will determine India's economic future." And it's an extraordinarily prescient remark. In 1987, not that long after the oil crisis, and of course, you mentioned the finance ministers speaking about the monsoon. The finance minister speaks even more often about oil prices, right? And that's something that is stuck in my mind ever since, because it contained a fundamental truth that governments, scientists, newspapers, policymakers, chambers of commerce, CEOs all forget, right? Or don't seem to understand. So that's just a remark that I don't want you to answer that, but just something that your talk brought in, that it's water, not oil, that will determine India's future, because this is the most basic resource, much more important than oil. Listening to you, there are a few questions few larger questions about water management and mismanagement that came to mind. And I'd like your responses to them. So there are only 3 or 4, and I'll go through them one by one. Now, if you look at the history of thinking about water and policy about water over the last 70, 80 years, the state, through science and large dams and these major water commissions, and more recently the market, to talk about groundwater markets and so on, has dominated discussion in India. But the community has been left out. And would you like to say something about that? Why has the community been left out of policy discussions, and what kind of implications that has?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And that reminder of Bandyopadhyay's 1987 article is salutary, I think. I mean, that is a fundamental insight, which, you're right, hasn't been given its due recognition. I think it's been interesting to see how the community has come into the debate over the last 70 or 80 years. It's always been at the margins. And yet, I think there are these strands of thought which, both in the sort of high statist era and in the sort of more market-oriented era that we have since the 1970s, the community has sort of come into the equation to complicate the nature of the discussion. I mean, I think there's a tradition of thought in the 20s and 30s of Indian rural sociologists and economists who are talking about local practices, and Mukherjee was just one example, there are many others, and there's a whole wealth of, even the Indian Agricultural Journal, those old issues from 1910s, 20s, even a publication like the Modern Review is very often interested in water harvesting, in particular traditions of water management in local areas. And then I think from the 70s, 80s, I mean, if I think of the first Citizens Report, 1982, that 1985 CSE report on called Dying Wisdom on local water harvesting practices, I think it has come back in. It's come back in through the work of NGOs. It's come back in through the work of community groups. Some of it has, I think, received recognition within policy circles, in the World Bank, etc. The question is whether that's more than lip service. And I mean, I think one of the questions is whether there's a disconnect between what seems to be the growing recognition that, very often community management over water bodies has had the most effective results, with this broader concern that, yes, but can those be scaled up? I think it always comes back to scale. That's almost the default answer to any example that one might give of sort of local restoration of water bodies or whatever. Yes, that's fine here, but can you do large-scale work with it? And I think that may be where we're stuck to some extent in the debate.
So I think the question of scale, you started with Mysore. And most people in this room would know of something about Vishwesvaraya, though I'm sure you'll learn much more after you read Sunil's book. But I was completely ignorant of Chakravarti, right? And that's the art of a historian, to bring back forgotten people with interesting ideas, unusual ideas, back into the debate. Then you moved from Mysore to Bengal, and you talked about Meghnad Saha and Radhakamal Mukherjee. Now, I think one of the problems with water policy in India, as practiced top-down, both in the colonial period and, of course, even by dissenters like Saha and, of course, by Nehru, it is one-size-fits-all. I mean, the ecological diversity of the country, indeed of each state. I mean, if you look at our state, Karnataka, right, there are at least 4 distinct ecological regimes, or 5. There's the coast, there's the Western Ghats, there's the Malnad, there's the arid kind of Deccan Plateau, and then there's Old Mysore. Now, and again, listening to your lecture, and I'm sure, reading your book, the sense of scaling up implies one size fit all, and that's antithetical in a sense that's it's antithetical perhaps to sound responsible water management, which must be a mix of top down and bottom up.
Thank you. I think that's exactly right, and I think that's one of the ways in which history sometimes sort of takes turns that people wouldn't have expected, because I mean, region is at the heart of almost all thinking about water in India, even British colonial thinking, until the early 20th century. And it is when these ideas are starting to filter through from the Tennessee Valley Authority, from the Soviet Union, that the idea that a one-size-fits-all top-down approach is the only thing that would be sufficiently large to solve these problems takes hold, and it takes hold of different quarters. I mean, it's taken hold of even the British colonial government by the 40s. I mean, remember, the Bhakra Dam and a number of others are actually planned. Srinath's book obviously tells us so much about how important the Second World War was. In fact, most of the big dam projects of the 50s were planned during the Second World War. And so by that point, even the British are thinking in that way. But in many ways, that's a surprise, because that's not at all how, if you think about British colonial meteorology in India, it was all about the fineness of the distinctions, of Karnataka, of each region, the micro-regions, microclimates. The British were obsessed with mapping the minutiae of those differences. And one of the things about meteorology that I find interesting is it was a fairly young science. It was, in some ways, looked down upon by the lab-based science as mere observation. But that also meant it was unusually open, even in the British colonial period. So the director of meteorology for all of Madras Presidency in the 1880s was a woman, which is very unusual in colonial science. Isis Pogson. She was the daughter of the astronomer of the Madras Observatory, and she started off as an assistant and rose to be the director of meteorology. In fact, the meteorological region of Madras was even bigger than Madras Presidency. It was open to Indians. They might not have been able to become director until the 1930s or 40s, but this, I don't want to give any causal, we can only speculate as to why this is, but think about how many great Indian thinkers actually did a stint in the meteorological department. Chintamani Ghosh did, before he founded the Modern Review. Advin Krishna Mehrotra wrote a wonderful essay on Chintamani Ghosh, in which he mentions that he spent 10 years working as a clerk in the meteorology department. Mahalanobis was a meteorologist in the 1920s. In late 20s, early 30s, he was doing partly based at Alipore Observatory, which is where Tagore wrote some of his most famous monsoon poems. So I think there was a way in which that intellectual tradition would have led one to expect that a much more regionally differentiated approach to water would take hold. And as to why it didn't, I suppose it was that whole mixture of things. It was this anxiety about famine or about disaster. It was the kinds of models that were circulating all over the world. And let's not forget, dam building was popular everywhere in the 40s and 50s. This was a global thing. And people looked on India with admiration for that.
So one more question on the same lines. Modern science, or the science of water management, the modern science of water management, it was motivated by the most noble and elevated desires to free this country of poverty and destitution. So I don't want to say anything about the motives. No one could have been a more public-spirited person than Saha. And dare I say it, in 2018, Jawaharlal Nehru too. All right. Now, but there's some problems with the kind of modern scientific approach when it comes to water management. And I think two are relevant, and I'm sure in your book you'll have much more to say, but I'd like your feedback to this audience. The first is that the modern science of water management is typically, till recently, at least from practice by the high priests, does not recognize ecological limits. Okay, so there's, if you read Trotsky or Mao, and who think man can completely reshape nature according to what man's desires, that's also Saha and Nehru. I don't know about Rao, I've not read K.L. Rao and Sen, but certainly, all right. So that's one thing that it doesn't really recognize, that nature can hit back and fight back and complicate things. The other, which listening to your talk brought me to understand, is that the modern science of water management also has a contempt for local folk indigenous knowledge. Now, this is quite interesting because, as you know, I've not worked on water, but I worked on forests, right? And that's also true of scientific foresters. And it's to their peril. Now, there's one area in which, in our country, the only area in which non-Western systems of knowledge are given some importance is health. All right. And I think it's all of us do yoga, we go to Ayurveda, if modern medicine can't cure us, we go to homeopathy, we go to Ayurveda, and so on, and often with good results. Not always with good results, but often with good results, right? Now, it seems to me that when it comes to natural resource management, whether it's forests, water, the sense that, look at the whole intricate network of tanks in South India. That was based on incredibly sophisticated knowledge, not only by the folklore will tell you the king designed it, but who ran it? Who did the desilting? Who did the community organization? And I think that's something, in your work, do you get a sense that scientists today are less hubristic, both with respect to nature and with regard to what they can learn from indigenous knowledge?
Sure. I think the disregard of ecological limits is characteristic of so many of those, of that generation of scientists that were working in the mid-20th century. It's very interesting. In the 1930s, when the UP government was trying to roll out this early scheme of electrified pumps to pump groundwater, there was a debate in the United Provinces Legislative Assembly, 1930s, I think 35 or 36, about whether groundwater was infinite. It's a very, very interesting debate. And the whole debate, and you actually had voices saying, look, we need to be careful about this resource. And there was some reference indeed to sort of local knowledge of aquifers, etc. And of course, the view prevailed that this was a resource that was infinite, that it would never end. I mean, that's just a small example, but I think those kinds of examples mount up so that by the 1940s, 50s, I would say the high point of that kind of Promethean thinking, as Ramaswamy Iyer called it, it's probably the mid-70s. And there is this very interesting essay published by the Harvard, he's actually an oceanographer, but then becomes a demographer, Roger Revelle, called Ganges Water Machine. And the architect, Anthony Achyavati, has actually published a book on the Ganga that uses that title, that tries to sort of imagine the river in different ways. And it really did sort of think of the Ganges as a machine, every bit of which could be engineered to boost production. I think that was probably the high point. I think one clearly sees a lot more sensitivity now. I was really struck by a recent paper in the journal Nature Climate Change by the climate scientist Deepthi Singh, who I think has been doing very interesting work on the monsoon. And she made a point that really sort of stuck with me because I've commented as a historian. She said, look, all of these climate models have done least well with the monsoon. It is the one vital climatic phenomenon that most models don't actually do very well to predict. And her answer is because they ignore the details of local topography. It's almost like a sort of full circle. And you have her writing in Nature Climate Change that what we need to do is to understand these microclimates, these local regional influences that for her may be one part of the explanation for why the monsoon doesn't behave like a lot of models predict that it needs to.
My last question before I open it up is, your book begins in the late 19th century. Now, of course, one way in which India has changed is that it's become a much more urban culture, civilization, polity, and economy. And much of the thinking when it came to water management for a long part of the period covered with your book is to manage water to alleviate rural distress and to boost farm productivities. Right. Now we are moving to a situation where probably we are 40% urban, I don't know the figures, but 500 million. And how water management in the cities becomes extremely important. One of my great intellectual heroes, and also the intellectual hero of some other people sitting in this room, is the late Anupam Mishra, who did extraordinary work in community water management, mostly in Rajasthan, but elsewhere. There's a wonderful episode in Rana Dasgupta's book, which you know about, and some of you, I should share this. This is Rana Dasgupta wrote a book called Capital, which is about Delhi. And it ends with a conversation with Anupam Mishra, whom I think is not identified by name, because that was the kind of person he was. And they talk about, the conversation is about the fact that all our great cities are based on rivers. And every river near a city is biologically dead. The Yamuna, the Arkavati, the Mula, the Muta, the Hooghly, and so on. And then he says, and Anupam Mishra tells Rana, he says, there was a time when there were festivals, water festivals, children would bathe, and the king would bathe. Now, what if every Independence Day, instead of giving a speech from the Red Fort, the Prime Minister was compelled to have a swim in the Jamuna? Now, 5 years it would be completely clean. Now, I think that's a wonderful image. But look, it's not just rivers. Look at our city. I mean, Bangalore had 70 tanks. Since we are in Bangalore, I would urge everyone here, every resident of Bangalore, who has not yet got a copy, to get a copy of Harini Nagendra's wonderful book, Nature in the City. It's a great ecological history of our city by a fine woman scientist trained at the IISc, now with APU. And it talks about the destruction of tanks and dams. So I think, look, how long will we pump up water from 100, 200, 300 miles away? So it's interesting that, my last question is to you would be, I think in our consciousness, Sunil, in our consciousness, we still haven't got to grips with the fact that we are a urban now. We were always an urban civilization, and now we are much more of an urban civilization. And the Indian environmental debate is for a long time was an argument in the cities about what to do in the countryside. The Narmada Andolan, the Chipko Andolan, the forest movement, X, Y, Z. And I'm sure that if you were to write this book 10 years later, I'm sure there's stuff on cities in your book now, but 10 years later there would be even more. Right. So some reflections on what are the challenges the increasing urbanization of India poses to our thinking and action about water.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things I did when I was working on this book was I had a lot of conversations with environmental activists in India, and a number of them did say, look, it's so recently that we realized that, urban India is as much there was a real recognition that, it was in the countryside that all of these, that one imagined water problems, that one designed solutions for water problems. And I mean, I think clearly urban water problems, there's been very interesting scholarship by both historians and anthropologists on Bombay's water supply, I think. And, the book on Bangalore, Nagendra's book is wonderful. And I think, we certainly need more of that. Given how much there is a paucity of urban history in India, we don't actually have great histories of most of India's major cities. And obviously an environmental dimension would be one part of it, but I think that's only one part of what we really need to do to be thinking about cities. But let me just sort of use one example of how we might start to bring this consciousness, and that is a figure whom I admire very much, who's been in the news for all the wrong reasons this weekend, T.M. Krishna. Many of you would have seen the song he recorded on Ennur Creek, the Paramboka song. And that was really a profoundly moving way to, in some sense, turn to history to think about the urban waterscape of Chennai. I mean, there is a historical narrative in the lyrics to that song. It is about the damming up or the concreting over of Chennai's water bodies. After the 2016 floods, I think there's been a lot of awareness of this. There are historians who are starting to work on, my friend Prasannan Parthasarathy has been mapping the tanks that were in Chennai in the early 20th century as part of his work on water and environmental change in the south. And I think there are ways that that kind of historical scholarship may come together with a more sort of public-facing, arts-based practice that makes us think about water that we depend on in our cities.
Thank you. And now we can open it up to questions from the audience.
Okay. Water everywhere, but now there is no water anywhere. That's what I think. And there is a saying that water wars are predicted all over, not only India, elsewhere also. What does the professor think of this water wars in future?
I think it can go both ways, because I think water is also one of those, I suppose, vital needs that can lead to unexpected cooperation as often as it can lead to conflict. So, the Indus Treaty with Pakistan is not flawless. It keeps coming back, either side raising questions on it. But it's actually remarkable that it's worked as well as it has over the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, that may not be sustainable if climate change changes river flow with all of the dams that are being built, but I think there are ways in which water wars are certainly not inevitable, and there's perhaps something about water that is such a vital material need that it can have other implications. I do worry about all the dams in the Himalayas which are being built on transboundary rivers. I mean, nobody would deny that there is possibility for conflict there. But, there are other regions of the world where this is just as likely to happen as it is in South Asia, I think.
Let me just add a footnote to that. I was in rural Tamil Nadu 2 weeks ago. And I drove from here to southern Tamil Nadu. I had to do some research there. And I passed the Kaveri. And it was full. And my first reaction was joy. And my second reaction was relief. because those of you who are as old as me know that there have been water wars between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. And if once there is scarcity, and so it is a real issue. But as Sunil says, hopefully it won't be a war. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on the third question that Ram had on science and how that, science and hubris. And one of the things I think that is, I'm Harini Nagendra, so you can't see me, Ram. Yeah, so one of the things I'm curious about is, if you look at Ram's work on forests or the work on dams, the way they thought about the environment was in the perspective of stocks and not flows, right? And not interconnections. And that's why it was environment as done by engineers. And in some sense, the science of ecology really evolved much later. In the 80s is when that came up. And the science of systems ecology and social ecological systems particularly, that thinking is much more recent, in the past 2 decades or so. So I'm just curious, have you seen anything in the archives or more recent discussions that lets, these sort of changes in our ecological perspectives, do they translate to dams? Or is it just still engineers working? Like in Bangalore, for instance, it's only civil engineers who restore our tanks, so it's not going to change,
Well, first of all, let me tell you how much I admire your book. I think it's wonderful and it's very nice I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think maybe we need to specify what branch of science we're talking about. And, we're not always talking about science with a capital S, which, in a sense we associate with engineering. I think ecology is actually where there have been the most interesting conversations between, say, scholars in the humanities and scientists, because of that focus on interconnectedness, on the focus of multiscalar thinking, on the focus of interdependence. And I think there are probably seeds in that kind of systems ecology, which, as you say, sort of evolves later on in the 20th century, that provides perhaps more of a way through. This is not a debate about science versus other forms of knowledge. I think it's about what different perspectives are taken seriously within the science that, of course, we need to be addressing these problems. And I think, I share your sense that in ecology, perhaps there is a more fruitful ground. I mean, I would just say that, in fact, you can trace some of that kind of ecological thinking back to the early 20th century, if not even before that. There are at least sort of some roots of that you see in India and elsewhere in terms of different ways of thinking about it. There's a very, very interesting book on Africa in the early 20th century by someone called Helen Tilley, which is precisely about the evolution of that kind of systemic ecological thinking in those particular contexts.
You talk about the challenge of scale, and that poses a limit on using community-based models. But it seems an idea that perhaps could have some potential there is the principle of subsidiarity, which says that the lowest level does what it can and delegates upwards. And that is an ancient principle that the Roman Catholic Church developed years ago, but the European Union has now made it its core. But it seems to me that we need to develop a new political philosophy that replaces the Enlightenment project, which is based on instrumental reason and top-down delegation.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think, in fact, architecture seems to be one of those fields where the most creative thinking is happening in these fields at the moment, in terms of living with the waterscapes that we have, particularly in relation to Ram's last question in terms of cities. But no, I do think fundamental rethinking is needed, that it is not just about the siting of this or that dam. I mean, it's much more about a view of the world and a view of what levels and what kinds of solutions might be appropriate to these problems. And, to the extent that I think, I do think that that's one way in which history can be useful, that one thinks about paths not taken, about ideas that perhaps did have a life once that we might have forgotten about. And it's not about reviving them or going back to them, but just that they perhaps could be a source of inspiration for the kinds of conversations that we have, very much more focused on our contemporary challenges.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. It occurs to me, people talk about hydroschizophrenia, that you must be familiar with that term. What's interesting to me about that is, while the official looks at surface water, scale, dams, and something like 400,000 crores has been spent on surface water and irrigation since independence. Actually, at a practical level, it's been taken away from from the top-down perspective because of the prevalence of simply the bore and the rig. And today there are 35 million bore wells, mostly in private hands. So this sort of, over just 40 years, decentralization of access to water has created a complete schism in the way water is technically managed and politically managed, and actually it's people's water. And India, as a groundwater civilization, using earlier the shallow aquifer and now the deep aquifer as well, has created a very different political economy in the water space. So when historians look at this, there is people's water and there is political water at that scale. And how would you talk about this in the context? I'm not even talking about issues of sustainability, sure, because we have all sorts of issues there, but really from a historical perspective about water.
I mean, I think you put your finger on something interesting, which is that most historians look at either one end of that scale or the other. So there's very interesting studies of a particular village and its uses of groundwater, over long historical periods. But a lot of the work by historians on water writ large is on official water. And I think that, it's precisely in trying to make the connection and exploring that paradox that, large dams have received so much public funding, so much public attention at precisely the moment when, in reality, they don't do much. In fact, the real irrigation boom, the miracle that you can talk about in sort of India's agricultural production since the 1970s is all groundwater driven. And it's driven, and it's almost like the tube well it's like the inverse of the dam in many ways. It is as private as it gets. And, that is itself a source of problems, I think, and that's the sort of other end of the scale of, so, we have these debates about whether there's too much or too little state involvement or state control, but in fact, the question is that in fact one has both. That perhaps. And
actually, the state is finding it very hard to understand how to regulate people's access to groundwater.
Right. That's right. And indeed, that as you suggested, that access is, in some sense, profoundly democratic, and at the same time, it reinforces or builds upon existing inequalities in terms of who can get access to that water.
You're right that the global climate models are not good enough for predicting, the impact of climate change on monsoon, simply because the computing power available today is not good enough to simulate, all the hydrological fluxes, all the other fluxes. But what's true is that in the last 30, 40 years, there's enough scientific evidence to show the monsoon pattern is changing. Even you go to the villages, they say, sir, the rainfall pattern has changed. We cannot predict. We don't know when to sow, when to harvest. So it's already happening. There are changes in the pattern. But the challenge in the coming decades is many of the models predict what we call, in quote-unquote, collapse of the monsoon, Asian monsoon. We don't know what that means. The models are not good enough, as I said, for the monsoon for prediction. If it happens, like, there are tipping points. One is destruction of Amazon, collapse of Asian monsoon. There are a few tipping points in the climate modeling findings. I wonder what will happen. All the traditional knowledge will be of no use. Even the current so-called water management will be no use. If there is a complete collapse of monsoon, it can happen in the next 20, 30, even 40 years. In the lifetime of many young people in this room, there could be a massive change in the monsoon. So that can affect everything else in India. We don't know. The worst thing in science is if you don't know, that's the worst thing. So today, the collapse of monsoon is in the horizon, but we don't know what it will be. We have a big challenge in the coming decades.
Thank
you. I just want to see whether you could speculate on what is the reason for the success of the Indo Water Treaty, because here's a treaty between India and Pakistan on very important rivers, and it has had less conflict than Kaveri between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So why is it that inter-country things withstood this, whereas can you just give a sense?
I wish I knew. I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. It can't be that there is a sort of governing body that oversees that, because the same way, India has plenty of bodies that oversee interstate river and other disputes. It's a really good question. I'm really not sure. I will leave that to sort of everyone to ponder. I wish I knew.
But if I can just a humorous footnote to that. I was, many years ago, I went to Pakistan. And, if you speak Hindustani, people don't know. So I was going to, you fly from Delhi to Lahore, and there was lots of water. I said, बरसात बहुत हुई है. I asked the steward. He said, नहीं यार, वो साले इंडिया वाले बहुत पानी छोड़ देते हैं. They want to screw our crops out. So at the popular level, there is still suspicion, but you're right, it works. Yeah.
So Ram likes to say that, India is not the most powerful or important country in the world, but it has strong claims to be the most interesting country in the world. And today's lecture is clearly sort of reinforced that. That is really why New India Foundation was set up to sort of think about post-1947 India. So I just quickly wanted to thank all of you for coming on a Sunday evening, bearing the traffic and everything else. I'd like to thank Times of India for partnering with us. They've been doing that for the last few years, and they've been great for that. Of course, Nandan and Rohini, the Kamdhenus of New India Foundation, they leave us, give us a lot of freedom to do what we want, and in ways that we want. Of course, Sunil, that was a remarkable lecture at the intersection of many disciplines, and we really thank you for coming. Ram, for being in the chair. Thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening.